Identifying mammals is tough. They're fast, they are cryptic, they a lot of times dive underground. They're not quite as flighty as birds, but sometimes birds aren't scared of us because they know they can fly. Mammals tend to be pretty skittish and like to hide. A lot of times they're just inactive during the day. Heck, a lot of them are nocturnal, so we're never going to see them. So how do you know what's there? Well, David Moskowitz, in his book Wildlife of the Pacific Northwest, introduced this concept of a funnel going from really the um, broad down to the narrow and saying, let's just take some big ideas that we know first before we try to get to the sort of pinpoint what exact species is this. And so starting with this broader bioregion or ecoregion idea is just where the heck am I? Am I in the Arctic Circle where it's frozen most of the year? Or am I in the southwestern deserts? Am I, over here in New England in the hardwood forests? Really going to have pretty different species lists in mind depending on where you are, broadly speaking. And then a little more specifically, what sort of habitat am I in? Is it a desert or is it a forest? Is it a woodland? Um, is it a coniferous forest? Is there snow a lot of the year? So narrowing it down a little bit more. And then, the forest is not just one giant mass of trees. There are meadows, there are rock slides or talus slopes like this one. There are cliff faces. There are, the deep forest floor. There are openings within the forest. And so think a little bit about that. Each species has its own preference. Some are very wide ranging. And so now we've really narrowed down the list of possibilities. And, if you think about it, this whole idea here, we've just eliminated kind of everything out here on these margins that wouldn't use that sort of microhabitat. So now we can start looking at what we're seeing right around us, if anything. And so let's say we're on one of these talus slopes here in the forest, and we see one of these little haystacks. That's kind of strange right in the middle of the rocks. Really kind of stands out and makes me think there's something to that. Maybe you even see these little tiny round scat pellets. You think, well, that's kind of strange too, right in the rocks. That's really bizarre. If you sit around and listen, you might hear this little chirping sound that seems like a bird hidden in the rocks. That's what I was the first time I encountered this critter. It just sits in there and goes meep, meep, meep. Really kind of strange. Maybe you'll catch sight of this little pika. Just one of the cutest, most adorable. If you wanted a pet, this would be the one. How cute is it? Not all of its features are adorable as its appearance, but it is just a doll. And it's an interesting little creature running around in these rock slopes all year round. It actually doesn't even hibernate. Has a real intolerance for heat, so don't try to bring these home, or you'll have to air condition your house all summer and turn off the heater in the winter. So you might encounter these guys. This was up by Clear Lake in some talus slopes, and found these little tiny pellets, smaller than a pea. Just that's it, scat, real dry. This is actually the first time I encountered the pika. Was in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Got a nice shot of it, but they're tough to catch. You can see how cryptic they are. Unless it stops, you're not gonna see it. So a lot of times we're stuck looking at signs of animals, what they leave behind, and sometimes that's not always pretty. Let's talk about the nicer stuff first. Let's talk about the tracks. There's kind of two main things they're going to leave behind, either tracks or scat, their poop. And I'm going to use this to kind of talk about herbivore versus carnivore. Now, that's just their diet. That's really not talking about anything specific about the animal itself, but it's a nice, really broad place to start. So if it's showing something with like a palm and 4 or 5 toes, like any of these guys, then it's probably a carnivore or something like that. If it's just showing hooves, then it's definitely an herbivore. All right, now these are pretty broad categories, like I said. Uh, because of the herbivore diet has lots of roughage, they eat a lot and they poop a lot. And most of their scat are these little pellets, small jelly beans, big jelly beans, like those ones I showed you of the Pika. That's pretty much what they're going to look like. So if you hear something tromping outside of your tent in the middle of the night and you're kind of scared about what it might be, well, it's probably an herbivore. They're the most abundant. And if you wake up the next morning and see a bunch of these, you didn't have to worry about being attacked in the middle of the night. If it's a carnivore, then it probably has more of a rope-like scat, a lot of times with hair in it or something like that. So there's one general way of distinguishing some of those signs left behind for tracks and for scat. Although, honestly, a lot of mammals are tiny, like that little pika. And scat is not real obvious. You got to look around, and most of us are not hiking out in the forest to look for little bunches of scat. So, in quite a few animals, if they live in the trees or in rocks like the pika, they're not going to leave tracks either. They're too light-footed, or they're just not walking on places where they actually leave footprints. So just a little bit more about scat. It's not healthy to dwell on all the crap that life deals us, but it's worth some consideration. I like puns. I can't help myself. All right, so coyotes and other carnivores are going to leave this rope-like scat, and it's pretty gross-looking stuff. Uh, Coyotes are omnivores, which is interesting. It said they're carnivores, but they do eat all kinds of stuff. And they like to leave their scat in obvious places because it actually serves a couple of functions. One is to get rid of waste, but it actually serves a really important function for animals, which is to mark their territory, especially carnivores, and lets other animals around know what's going on with them. It's kind of a calling card. Herbivores, on the other hand, leave scat not so much as a calling card, although it does give some information about them. But like I said, it's usually these dry, kind of round pellets, and that one's not elk scat, I don't believe. Looks a little bit small. Maybe it is. And other organisms like heather voles, which are rodents, leave sometimes giant piles. So this is like a whole winter pile of it. They have this one special area they set aside. You don't always think of rodents as really all that cleanly and hygienic, but these heather voles live under the snow all winter, and they designate one area as their latrine, which is actually kind of nice. But same sort of thing. They leave these little piles of scat, and you can know that the heather voles have been around, and there you go. Tracks. Again, a little bit about that. If you have a carnivore, it's often going to have some claw marks with the tracks. You can see 1, 2, 3, 4 toes in terms of the coyote, and then that palm pad right there. Whereas ungulates, they're kind of strange. I can point out back here on this cow elk right here, that is the heel of the foot. And we'll get into that a little bit later in the class, but strange as that might seem, that's where the foot starts. The knee is way up here. And, oops. So what they're walking on is their tiptoes. So they just leave these two toenail prints that we call hooves, and that's what at least the larger herbivores look like. Now, I just said the heather vole is a rodent and is an herbivore, so obviously that doesn't go for all of them, but if we're just talking about general signs, there you go. And you'd have to be a pretty talented tracker to track down a heather vole using just their footprints, so probably not too relevant anyway. Now, there are lots of other signs we can look at. Let's just take a peek at a few. Signs of foraging. Up on Clemens Mountain, I found this ponderosa pine. Not a real tasty treat, but obviously clipped off. And based on the height it was clipped off, I would say it's probably an elk. Um, and I'm a botanist, so take everything I'm saying here about mammals at that value. Some I'm sure about, like this one, I can say with quite a bit of certainty that was a beaver. Not many other animals are going to be able to take off wood in that way, fell an entire tree and leave these big old wood chips behind. So that's a nice obvious sign of a beaver. This one, some signs of foraging on, it looks like a willow trunk there, kind of stripped away. Could be from deer trying to eat that inner bark, a little high up to be eating like rabbits or whatnot. Could be a porcupine, not entirely sure, but there's some signs of foraging. Burrowing. So a lot of our rodents burrow. They leave small, medium, large holes, and so you can tell a little bit about them. So these eskers over here, these little piles of kind of the soil thrown behind them as they burrow under the snow all winter, are left behind. That can be voles or a variety of other organisms. Here's a ground squirrel hole, and you can get the general idea of the size of the rodent based on the size of the hole. We can also tell kind of how recently they've been around. I knew this guy was probably still in there based on the freshness of the soil in that throw mound there, whereas this very large marmot hole, um, he probably wasn't awake yet. This was March out on Clemens Mountain, and although some freshly turned dirt, I'm thinking he probably wasn't up yet. Uh, Carnivores and herbivores both will leave these signs in trees. So this to me looks like there's quite a few of these vertical marks, probably scratch marks from the claws, maybe a cougar or a bear, and in all likelihood. And then there's antler rubs that are pretty common. They don't have that same sort of vertical scratching, but the elk and deer will just thrash the heck out of a tree, usually around this height, and try to rub the velvet off their antlers. And then sometimes you find bones, fragments of bones, which are a sign of both herbivore and carnivore at times. Antler sheds are another sign that you might find around it. Another way of identifying mammals, especially those small nocturnal ones, which is most of the rodents, is to go out and trap them. And people have been trapping for many years, usually for the animal pelts, but for scientific purposes, trapping is one way to go. And so here I'm holding this little deer mouse. I don't look very happy with him. This was helping a professor out with some research when I was in college. Um, and maybe this one bit me. I'm not sure. I got bit a couple times and it wasn't pleasant. So maybe that's why I look a little perturbed. Most mammals don't just stand up like this yellow marmot over here. They're pretty bold up there on Mount Whitney, and they are photogenic, though. They just stand up and say, hey, take a picture of me. And they're out during the day and everything else, but kind of hard to get a picture of them unless you're close enough and they're bold like these marmots. But more recently, we have these motion sensor camera traps. And this one, we sat with several students out at Waterworks Canyon out at the base of Mount Clemens, and starts taking pictures, and when the motion sensor is trapped, and so down here you can see a little head appearing, and then the next slide apparently is not real quick on the draw. It's kind of a cheap one. You can see a few of these bighorn sheep heading back up the hill. So that's a nice way. Hunters will use these obviously as well. That's the little bulletproof title down here, but a nice way of seeing what is around, what animals are around. It's really revolutionized quite a bit of mammal research, even documented that wolverines are actually still here in Washington state. Thought they had been gone, but they're so rare that it's just hard to know if they're around or not. There's only just a few in the state, but one was caught on a camera trap. And then there was another several years ago, but caught on a camera trap in the Sierra Nevada in California, which was a pretty big deal. People had been fairly certain they were gone from California, but it turns out they had persisted. So there you go, identifying mammals, figuring out what they are by their signs and different ways of catching them to see what they are.